This is chapter 4, looking at the tissue level of organization within the body systems. So tissue, this is just basically going to be a group of similar type of cells that are usually going to come from a similar or the same embryonic origin. So when you're developing inside mom, these are going to be cells that are coming from the same, they're originating from the same type of cell. And these cells that make up a tissue are typically going to be used to participate in a specific function. So the extracellular matrix that's going to surround that connection, those connections between the cells, is going to be composed of, that's going to compose those tissues, is going to also influence the structure as well as the properties of a specific tissue. So not only is it the cells that make up the tissue that are influencing the structure and the function of that tissue, but also the connective, extracellular connective material around those cells is also going to influence this. So depending on their function and the structure of these cells, of these tissues, there's going to be various types of tissues in the body, and we're going to group them into 4 main groups. We've got epithelial tissues, connective tissues, and those are going to be the 2 main types of tissue that we're going to focus on today for this lecture. Muscular tissue and nervous tissue are the other types of tissues there, but they have entire chapters dedicated to them later in the lecture series, so we won't worry too much about them for now. So for starters, we're going to start with epithelial type tissue. This is going to be a tissue that's responsible for covering the body surfaces. It's also going to line hollow organs as well as body cavities, various ducts, as well as forming glands. Epithelial tissue is going to allow the body to interact with both internal and external environment. And we're going to look at the components of this a little bit more in depth here. So the next type of tissue that we have is connective tissue. This is going to be useful in providing protection and support for the body and all the various organs that are associated with it. There are a wide array of types of connective tissues. These are going to do everything from binding organs together. They're going to store energy reserves as fat. They are going to help to provide the body with immunity against any kind of disease-causing organisms, those wee beasties and botulism kind of thing. They're going to provide that immune aspect. So they do a lot of different things. And we'll look again at these 2 types of tissue very in-depth, with great detail. Our next type of tissue is muscular tissue. This is going to be composed of cells that are specialized for the contraction and as well as generation of force. This is going to be this process is also going to generate heat that's going to warm the body, and this whole process is called thermogenesis, and we'll talk more about that in later chapters. And then our final type of tissue that we're going to sort of just touch on briefly is nervous tissue. This is going to detect changes in the various conditions both inside and outside the body, and they're also going to be responsible for responding to these stimuli by generating various electrical signals called nerve impulses or nerve action potentials. And these are going to do a couple of different things. They can activate muscle contractions as well as glandular secretions, or they can trigger the other nervous impulses as well. So they can do a lot of different things. So before we move forward, we have to look at how all of these cells in a tissue are going to be held together. They're going to come together and form, how many cells can come together and form one big hunk of tissue. So they're going to use something called cell junctions, and these are just basically going to be contact points that are going to be between the plasma membrane of the cells and the actual tissue cells. So we've got 5 main types of cell junctions. We've got tight junctions, adherens junctions, desmosomes, hemidesmosomes, and gap junctions. And we're going to look at each of these individually, and you can see each of these types of cell junctions here in this image. So the first type of cell junction that we're going to look at is the tight junction. Right, so this is going to consist of these web-like strands that we see here, these transmembrane proteins. So these are proteins that are going to span all the way across that cell membrane. So they are transmembrane. So these transmembrane proteins are then going to fuse together the outer surfaces of the various adjacent cell plasma membranes. And this is going to help to seal off a passageway between those adjacent cells. All right, so this is really important because this is going to inhibit the passage of various substances between those cells. And this is going to prevent the contents of various organs from leaking, which is very important. So it's going to prevent them from these organ contents from leaking into the blood or surrounding tissue. So, as you may have guessed, these types of cell junctions are going to be found in epithelial tissue that's going to line the stomach, the intestines, the urinary bladder. So these are essentially going to form a watertight seal in that cell to kind of keep your stomach or stomach contents or your bladder contents, etc., from sort of oozing and leaking out into other parts of the body. So in order to remember this, next time somebody asks you if a frog's ass is watertight, you tell them it most certainly is if it has a tight junction. Next, we have the adherens junctions. Right? These are going to contain these little plaque proteins, right? So you can see them here. These are going to be dense layers of proteins that are going to be found on the inside of that plasma membrane, and these are going to attach to both the membrane proteins and to the microfilaments that we have of that cytoskeleton, so the structural part of the cell, essentially. We then have cadherin proteins, and these are going to be transmembrane proteins that are going to be responsible, these cadherin proteins here, that are going to be responsible for joining these two cells together. So they're kind of forming these linked proteins, essentially. So each cadherin protein is then going to insert into the plaque from the opposite side of that plasma membrane. So plaque is really serving as a good anchorage point. These cadherin proteins are then going to partially cross that intercellular space, and they're going to connect and hook onto the cadherin proteins to the adjacent cell that are also anchored to the plaque on the other side. These types of junctions are going to help epithelial surfaces to resist separation, and they're going to that could potentially happen during contractile activities, things like food moving through the intestines. These are also going to form something called an adhesion belt, and you can see sort of these adhesion belts kind of forming, and these are going to wrap around the cell, which we can see if we go back here. We see our little adhesion belt from our adherens junction here. So that's our adherens junction. Next, we have the desmosome. These are pretty cool. Actually, a friend of mine in grad school took these pictures. Very cool stuff. So these are going to contain plaques as well as transmembrane glycoproteins or cadherins. And these are going to extend into the intracellular space between those adjacent cell membranes. And they're going to attach to the cells on the other side. And you can kind of see those here. See? So these plaques are going to attach to intermediate filaments, and these are going to be, again, another component of the cytoskeleton. And these intermediate filaments are going to consist of a protein called keratin. So these desmosomes, these are going to be a very strong type of cell junction. These are kind of like a spot weld, if you will. So they're going to be very strong type of cell junction here. And these are commonly found in cells that are going to make up the epidermis, as well as cardiac muscle cells. And these desmosomes are going to be really important in preventing epidermal cells from separating during any kind of like tension on this tissue, as well as from helping to prevent cardiac muscle cells from pulling each other apart during the contractions of that heart. So these are really important cell junctions here that we've got. Our fourth type of cell junction that we have is called a hemidesmosome. These are going to look like half of a desmosome. So hemi means half. So when we talk about a V8 hemi, something about that has been halved. I don't know anything about cars, but half. Hemi means half. So these are basically half of a desmosome. And these are interesting ones because these are unique. They are going to anchor cells to the basement membrane. So these are essentially the cell junctions that are responsible for holding that base layer of cells on to the basement membrane, that bottom layer of tissue there. All right, so these are only going to be found on the bottom side of the cell. All right, now these are going to be made up of transmembrane glycoproteins that are called integrins. And on the inside of the plasma membrane, these integrins are going to attach to those intermediate filaments that are, again, made of keratin. And then on the outside of that plasma membrane, those integrins are going to attach to protein called laminin. And this is going to be present, this is a protein that we're going to find in the basement membrane, excuse me. So this is going to be where things are going to sort of anchor. So here's our hemidesmosome, it's half a desmosome. And then last but not least, for our cell junctions, we have the gap junction. And these are kind of cool. So these are going to be made up of little membrane proteins called connexins. So the individual proteins are called connexins. And these multiple connexins are going to form these little tiny fluid-filled tunnels. And these tunnels are called connexons. All right, so connexins and connexons. So get those straight in your head there. And these connexins are going to essentially form a tunnel that's going to connect neighboring cells. All right, so through these connexons, things like ions, little ions, and small molecules are going to be able to diffuse through the cytosol from one cell to another. And this is going to be really handy because this is going to allow for the movement of some nutrients and oxygen, removal of waste from very avascular areas. However, these connexons are small, so they're going to prevent the passage of large, big, chunky proteins, big molecules like that. So like I said, these type of cell junctions, these gap junctions, are found in avascular tissues, things like the lens and the cornea of your eyeball. These are going to be useful for transferring nutrients and removing waste from the tissue. These type of junctions are also going to enable nerve and muscle impulses to spread very rapidly among those cells. And this is going to be really important for the proper operations of various aspects of the nervous system, as well as a coordinated contraction of the muscles, things that we find, the muscles of the heart, the gastrointestinal tract, as well as the uterus, all important things there. So that is all we have really to discuss with the various types of cell junctions. Now we are going to look at the two main types of tissue that we're going to talk about today. And those are the epithelial and the connective types of tissue. So before we get started, we're just going to do a brief kind of overview comparison of these two tissues. We've got epithelial tissue and connective tissue. All right, and they are going to look very, very distinct. All right, so for our epithelial tissue, you can see this here. All right, we've got a lot of cells that are packed in tight, and they're going to have very little extracellular matrix. All right, you can see all of this is just cells that are just packed in tight. Epithelial tissue is also going to typically have no to very few blood vessels, and these are typically going to be, these are always going to form a surface layer of some sort of organ or tissue. These are not going to be covered by any other tissue. All right. This is going to be interesting because in comparison to our connective tissue, where epithelial cells or tissue are always going to form that outermost layer, beneath that is where we're going to find our connective tissue. So these are not ever going to be on the surface layer. All right. These are going to be made up of cells that are going to be widely scattered throughout a very large amount of extracellular matrix that's going to separate those cells. Connective tissue is also going to have a significant network of blood vessels. Two exceptions to this are going to be cartilage and tendons. These are going to be fairly avascular, very avascular in nature, but they are still connective tissues. So a lot of the times, it is very, very common. It is very common to see these tissues together, all right, with the outermost layer being epithelial tissue, and then the subsequent bottom or lower layers, deeper layers, being the connective tissue. Right? And these two, because they are so different, are going to work together really nicely to accomplish the various things, each thing that one or the other can't achieve on their own. So it is going to work together quite nicely. So moving forward, we're going to start with our epithelial tissue. So starting with our epithelial tissue. First of all, we're going to need to discuss some directional terms in order to before we can talk about these tissues. So we're going to have two general patterns for arranging epithelial tissue. All right, we're going to have the covering and lining epithelium. This is going to be the surface epithelium, and this is going to this is going to form the outer covering of the skin, as well as some of those internal organs. This is also going to form the inner lining of blood vessels, as well as various ducts, body cavities, as well as the interior of the respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive systems. It is important to remember that all of these systems are technically open to the outside world, and that is why they're going to have a layer of covering and lining epithelium on that outer surface there. The other type of epithelial tissue that we have is glandular epithelium. And this is going to make up the secreting portion of the various glands that we have in the body. These are going to be things like the thyroid gland, the various adrenal, sweat, digestive glands, etc. All right, and a unique aspect to our glandular epithelium is that it's going to have a reticular lamina. And this is just going to be an extra layer of tissue that's going to be closer to the underlying connective tissue of. It's going to be deep to that epithelial tissue there. Now, again, looking at some directional terms as far as our cells are concerned with this epithelial tissue. We're going to have, first of all, we're going to have the apical surface of a cell or a tissue. All right, and this is going to be the cells that are going to face the body's surface or into that body's cavity. They also could potentially face the lumen of an internal organ or the tubular ducts that are going to receive the actual secretions from that cell. So this is the top, the apex, the apical membrane, the free surface essentially. We then have the lateral surface. So if you're moving laterally, you're moving side to side. So just like that, the lateral surface is going to face the adjacent cells on either side. And this is going to contain 4 out of the 5 types of cell junctions. All right. The 5th type of cell junction, being the hemidesmosome, is of course only going to be found on the basal surface, this bottom side, remember, because this is going to be where we're going to anchor those epithelial cells to the basement membrane. So like we said, the basal surface is going to be opposite to our apical surface, and this surface is going to be the deepest layer of epithelial cells, and this is going to adhere to the extracellular material, things like that basement membrane that are going to be down below our layer of epithelial cells. And then we've mentioned this basement membrane. This is going to be a thin sort of extracellular layer that's going to have it's typically going to have 2 layers to it. All right, we've got our basal lamina. Right, this is going to be the more superficial of the layers. This is going to be closer to and secreted by the actual epithelial cells themselves. So they're laying down their own layers. They're laying down their own flooring, essentially. And then below our basal lamina is going to be the reticular lamina. And this is going to be closer to the actual connective tissue that's going to underlie our epithelial tissue there. Oops. So, as with everything in science, we like to group and to classify, that stuff. Tissues and epithelial tissues are no different, and there are several different ways in which we can group or classify our epithelial tissue. And the first way that we're going to do this is based on the arrangement of our cells in layers. All right, so the first way is that we can classify this, or the first classification of epithelial tissues, I should say, is a simple epithelium. All right, this is just basically going to be a single layer of cells, and this is going to be really important for things like diffusion, osmosis, filtration, secretion, absorption, because this is going to be a very thin layer of cells. It's just a single flat layer of cells. So various other nutrients and molecules, etc., are going to be able to move through these layers. So they are really great for filtration, diffusion, etc. All right. And this is shown here as C. All right. Next, we have the pseudo-stratified epithelium. So pseudo meaning like faux, like not quite stratified epithelium. This is going to look like it's got multiple layers of cells. And you can see that here in A. And this is going to be because the nuclei in each of these cells are going to be at different layers within the cell. So it's going to look like there are multiple layers of cells. However, all of these cells are going to still rest on that basal membrane. So so as a result of this kind of this pseudo-stratified, pseudo-layered look, not all of these cells are going to actually reach the apical surface. And that's really going to contribute further to that pseudo-stratified looking arrangement here that we can see in A. And then last but not least, we have the stratified epithelium. All right, so stratified, if it's stratified, it means it's got layers. So this is a stratified epithelium is going to consist of 2 or more layers of cells, and these are going to be responsible for protecting any kind of underlying tissue. And this is going to be found in locations where we get a lot of wear and tear on tissue. So just extra layers are going to provide extra protection. The next way that we can classify our epithelial tissue is based on the shape of those cells. All right, so our first type of cell shape classification that we have is the squamous cell. These are going to be made up of thin cells that are going to allow for rapid passage through various substances through them. These are, again, great for filtration, diffusion, etc. You can see these here in A. These are squamous cells. We then have our cuboidal cells. These are going to be shaped like little cubes, as the name implies. These are going to be about as tall as they are wide and are either shaped like cubes or sometimes hexagons. These cuboidal cells can sometimes have these little microvilli, these little sort of hair-like projections on their apical surface, and these are going to be excellent in functioning in either secretion or absorption. We find these a lot of times in the lining of the some of the airways as well as the gut. We also have these, you can see this here, those are little cuboidal cells. And then last but not least, we have our columnar cells. These are going to be shaped like columns, and as such, they are going to be taller than they are wide. As you can see, our little columnar cells. And these are also going to be excellent at protecting underlying tissue. These columnar cells may also have either cilia or microvilli on their apical surface, on their top surface there, and are often going to be specialized for secretion or absorption. We find these guys lining the gut for secretion or absorption of various enzymes and absorbing various nutrients. All very important cells. We found a lot of these guys in the gut. We then have something called a transitional cell. And these guys are kind of unique. So these are going to change in shape depending on the status of the organ. So these cells can look like either a squamous cell or a more cuboidal cell, depending on the stretch that's being applied to the organ. We find these in the urinary bladder. So when our bladder is empty, these transitional cells are going to look more like cuboidal cells. Right? However, when the urinary bladder is full and it's been stretched, they're going to resemble something more similar to squamous cells in their shape. They're going to be stretched out and thinned. All right. Now, with these covering and lining epitheliums, we're going to have quite a few different combinations. You could basically combine our various ways of classifying these epithelium with shape and layering. 6 ways to Sunday, essentially. So we can have all of these various different types of covering and lining epithelium. All right. So we have the simple epithelium. This can be simple squamous epithelium, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, etc. Epithelium, as well as a pseudostratified columnar epithelium. These last ones all can be either ciliated or non-ciliated. It can go either way. And then within our stratified epithelium, we can have a stratified squamous epithelium. We can have stratified cuboidal epithelium, stratified columnar epithelium. And then we have those transitional epithelium, or the urothelium as it's sometimes called, because they do line the urinary tract. Now, these types of tissues are important. They can be found in your textbook in table 4.1. And you are going to need to know the descriptions as well as potential locations and functions for these cells or these types of tissue that are listed here. It'll be kind of sort of a multi-matchy kind of, multiple matching kind of situation for the exam, just so you know. So those are our covering and lining epithelium. Definitely take a look at that table 4.1. Now, as far as we've mentioned these covering and lining epithelium, the other type of epithelial tissue that we can have is the glandular epithelium. So a gland is quite simply going to be epithelium that is responsible for secreting substances into a duct. So just like the duct work that you have in your house, a duct is basically just a tube. And so these are going to secrete these substances either into those ducts or onto the surface, or sometimes eventually into the blood, where it can then, when ducts are not present. So we've got a couple of different types of glands that we're going to talk about. We've got endocrine glands and we've got exocrine glands. So endocrine glands, endo meaning within, so the endocrine glands are going to be responsible for secreting hormones that are going to be secreted into that interstitial fluid, and then those hormones are going to diffuse into the bloodstream without flowing through any kind of duct. All right. Now, exocrine glands are going to be the important ones here. These are going to be, sorry, exocrine glands are going to be the ones we're going to focus on primarily. So, our exocrine glands, these are going to secrete their products into ducts that are going to empty onto the surface of a covering and lining epithelium. So these are going to be things that are going to empty onto the skin surface or into the lumen of hollow organs. And we're going to look at a couple of different options for these here. Now, just like with our covering and lining epithelium, we can classify these guys in lots of different ways. Structural classifications being a big one. All right, so when we look at our exocrine cells, we can classify them by the number of cells that are going to make up these glands. These can be unicellular glands. They can be made up of only one cell, like the goblet cell here that you can see, that's responsible for secreting mucus into various portions of the body. This is looking at the small intestine here. Or you could have a multicellular gland. We're going to look at several of these in just a minute. The other way that we can characterize the structural classification for our exocrine glands is whether or not these are going to be unbranched or branched ducts, and these can either be simple or compound. Or we can look at the shape of the secreting portion, whether it is tubular, sort of tube-shaped, acinar, which is kind of more bulbous and rounded, or tubular acinar, which is somewhere in the middle there. So here we have a very handy little image to look at the various classifications that we have of our multicellular exocrine glands. So like we mentioned, we've got a couple of different classifications here. We've got our tubular, right? It's kind of more of a tube-shaped secretory portion is what we're looking at. All right. We then have the acinar, which is going to be kind of more bulbous at the end here. And then we've got our sort of tubulo-acinar, which is kind of somewhere in the middle. It's going to be sort of, I don't know. It's sort of a mix between the two. All right. Now, we can then look at whether or not these multicellular exocrine glands are simple or branched, whether they're simple branches or a more compound branching system here. So if we've got a simple branching here, or we've got a more compound where there's multiple branches coming off here, we can have the simple branched tubular and compound tubular. We've got a compound acinar and a simple branched acinar. And then we've got the compound tubulo-acinar, where we've got more branches coming off of each individual branch here. Then there's also the shape. We've got a simple coiled tubular. These are going to be important for things like sweat glands. So as far as where you can find some of these, we've got the simple tubular can be found in some of these glands that are found in the large intestine. As far as our simple branched tubular glands, these are going to be found in gastric glands as well. A simple coiled tubular, like I mentioned, is going to be useful in sweat glands, where you're going to need to fit a lot of these little guys in a small little surface area. So they're going to have this kind of coiled shape in order to accommodate that increased demand for space. Our simple acinar cells are going to be found in the penile urethra. Who knew? Then the simple branched acinar that we have here, these are found in sebaceous glands. These are like the oil glands that you have on your face, your skin, etc. Compound tubular glands, these are going to be found in the bulbal urethral gland or the Cowper's gland in the gentleman. The compound acinar glands, these are found in mammary glands. And last but not least, our compound tubulo-acinar glands are found in the acinar glands within the pancreas. So they're going to be responsible for secreting some of those digestive enzymes. So, so those are our various types of multicellular exocrine glands. Very, very cool stuff, honestly. Now, we can also classify our exocrine glands via function. All right, so we've got three main functions here. We've got merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine glands. All right, so for starters, we've got our merocrine glands. These are going to have secretions that are going to be synthesized by the ribosomes that we have in the rough endoplasmic reticulum within the cell. Those secretions are then going to be packaged by that Golgi complex and are going to be released from the cell in these little secretory vesicles. So they're just releasing these little vesicles here. These are found in the salivary glands. We then have the apocrine glands. All right, these are going to be these are going to be glands where the secretory product is going to accumulate in the apical surface, the top surface side of that cell, and then a portion of that cell, that apical portion, is going to be sort of pinched off by exocytosis, and this is how we're going to release those various cellular secretions, just basically by pinching off the top side of that cell. These are found in mammary glands. This is one of the reasons that, so these are found in mammary glands. So like during milk production, like during lactation, this is how that milk is produced. And then we also then have the holocrine glands. All right, so these are going to secrete products that are going to accumulate in the cell's cytosol, so within the cell itself, and then the cell is basically going to rupture, and it's going to release those secretions. So these secretions are going to contain a large amount of lipids, and this is going to be due to that ruptured cell plasma membrane, as well as any of that extracellular matrix. So any of the lipids that are found holding these cells together, basically forming that cellular membrane, all of those are being released. This is why those sebaceous glands, those oil glands that we have on our skin, are going to be, those secretions are going to be so oily, is because of the way that those secretions are going to be released from the cell. By basically rupturing the cell. So those are those oil glands that you got there. All right. So that is all we have for the epithelial tissue. So now we're going to move on to the connective type tissues. And there are quite a few different categories for connective tissue. So this is a bit of a more in-depth look, but still important here. So moving on now to the connective tissue. There's going to be a couple of different features to mature connective tissue. We're going to focus primarily on, or exclusively on, mature connective tissue. The other type of connective tissue is fetal connective tissue, but that's a lecture for another class. So we're not going to worry about that. This mature connective tissue is going to consist of two basic elements. We've got the cells that make up the tissue, and then we've got the extracellular matrix. And this is going to be formed by a variety of ground substances, as well as a certain of different fibers that are going to give it that structure. So ground substance is going to be the component of that connective tissue that's going to be between the cells and the fibers, and this is going to support the cells, and it's going to provide also a medium for exchange between the blood and the cells. The connective tissue cells are not going to have any free surfaces, and this connective tissue is always going to be highly vascularized, and it's going to have a pretty extensive nerve supply. Again, the exception to this rule being tendons and cartilage, which are extremely avascular. Now, looking at the various cells and the fibers that make up connective tissue. All right, we've got an assortment of different of all of these things sort of illustrated quite nicely here. We've got some reticular fibers, elastic fibers, we've got our various fibers here, and so we're going to actually look at these in a different way, but it's nice to sort of see them visually laid out, so how they're going to kind of supply that structure to the connective tissue. Now, the different types of fibers that we're going to find in connective tissue. There are three main fibers. We've got collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. So collagen fibers, these guys are strong, but they're not stiff and they're not stretchy. So they're going to allow for tissue flexibility. These are going to occur in sort of parallel bundles. They're going to add to the tensile strength that we see for various tissues. I kind of like to think of these guys like pool noodles. They're flexible. You can bend them, but you can't stretch them or stretch or compress them. So they do provide a good bit of tensile strength. We then have our elastic fibers. These are going to be smaller in diameter than what we see for our collagen fibers. And these elastic fibers are going to branch pretty extensively and are going to join together with other elastic fibers to form a very fibrous sort of network within the connective tissue. These elastic fibers are also going to be strong, but these ones are also going to be stretchy, and they're going to be able to return to their original shape after being stretched. And then our last type of fiber that we have in connective tissue is going to be reticular fibers. These are going to be produced by fibroblasts and are going to be much thinner than what we see in our collagen fibers. These reticular fibers are going to form branching networks and are going to provide support to the walls of those blood vessels and are also going to form a network around the cells of that tissue. Now, here we have quite the extensive list or classification for our mature types of connective tissue. All right, we've got our connective tissue proper. This is going to include our loose and dense connective tissue. This is going to be things like adipose tissue, areolar connective tissue. Dense connective tissue is going to be things like dense regular or irregular connective tissue. These are going to be examples of like tendons are going to be a great example of a dense regular connective tissue. We then have our supporting connective tissue. These are going to be things like cartilage and bone. All right. So cartilage is going to include hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage, and we'll look at all three of these. And then the other type of supporting connective tissue that we have is bone. We've got compact and spongy bone. We're not going to get into bone so much because, well, we've got an entire chapter on that later. So the last type of connective tissue, mature connective tissue that we'll have to discuss, and we'll only discuss it very briefly because there are entire chapters dedicated to it in the book, are the liquid connective tissues, and these are going to include blood and lymph. I've also included a link here in the PowerPoint to an interactive link to this through Wiley Plus. I think this is super handy and really very useful. So if that's your cup of tea, feel free to check it out. So now moving forward, we're going to look at each of these types of connective tissue individually, starting with our loose connective tissue. We've got areolar connective tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular connective tissue. So our areolar connective tissue, this stuff is going to consist of collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers, so all three types of fibers, and these are going to be arranged fairly, sorry about that, technical difficulties. These are going to be arranged fairly randomly and are going to have several different types of cells sort of embedded in a semi-fluid ground substance. All right, so this you can see the structure here. So areolar connective tissue is going to be found in and around most of your body's structures. They're going to be found quite extensively in the subcutaneous layer of the skin, as well as in the lamina propria of various mucous membranes, as well as around blood vessels, nerves, and bodily organs. Functionally, these guys are going to provide strength and elasticity, as well as some support. So we are going to go, when we are in the lab, we're going to look at examples of all of these types of tissue under the microscope, so this is going to be handy information for later, so keep that in mind. Next, we have the adipose tissue. These are an interesting type of tissue. These are going to contain large numbers of these little fat-storing adipocytes, these little cells that are responsible for holding on to all that adipose, all those little lipid droplets. These are going to be surrounded by kind of sort of scattered reticular fibers that we can, let's see if we can kind of see those in blue there. And they're also going to have a fairly rich vascular network. These guys are going to be found anywhere that you have areolar connective tissue. All right, so they are going to be found around the heart, the kidneys. They're also going to be found within yellow bone marrow. They're going to be found in the subcutaneous layer that's deep to the skin. Also going to be really important for padding behind joints, as well as padding around the joints, as well as behind the eyeballs and the eye sockets. As annoying as these particular type of tissue can be, sometimes it is definitely a very important type of tissue to have some of, at least. So you don't want to get rid of all your adipose tissue. Functionally, this type of tissue is going to store fat, It's going to help provide a kind of a cushion, and it's also going to fill space, like what we talked about here with our eyeball sockets. It's going to help to kind of prop up those eyeballs so that they're sitting nicely in the actual orbits of your head, so they're not sunken down there. Then additionally, a type of adipose tissue called brown adipose tissue, this bat stuff here. This is also going to provide insulation for maintaining babies' temperature when they're newborns. So babies are able to burn this brown adipose tissue as a heat source. So pretty handy. Next, we have, for our third type of loose connective tissue, we have our reticular connective tissue. This is going to help. This is going to be a tissue that's going to contain that fine sort of interlacing network of these reticular fibers. You can see this here. And we'll check this out in the lab. It's a very distinct looking sort of tissue. These are going to be, these reticular fibers are going to be formed by thin collagen fibers as well as reticular cells. The reticular connective tissue is going to be found in the stroma, or the supporting framework that we have in the spleen, the liver, the lymph nodes. This is going to be really handy as far as filtration. So reticular connective tissue is going to be excellent at filtrating various things. It's also going to help to bind smooth muscle tissue together. And like we mentioned, it's going to be really fantastic at filtering and removing any kind of worn out red blood cells in the spleen, as well as any sort of microbes that we might have in the lymph nodes. So excellent filtration. Our next type of connective tissue is the dense connective tissue. All right. We have our dense, a couple of different kinds. We've got dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue, and elastic connective tissue. Our dense regular connective tissue is going to be nicely organized. You can see how it's tightly packed and everything's in a nice, neat order. This is going to form the sort of shiny white extracellular matrix. This is mainly going to be primarily made up of collagen fibers, and these are going to be arranged in nice, regularly organized little bundles within which there are going to be fibroblasts that are going to be sort of embedded within these connective fibers here. Collagen fibers are not living, all right? So that means that these fibroblasts are going to secrete them. So any sort of damage that you do to a tendon or ligament that's going to be made up of these collagen fibers is going to be very slow to heal, because it is a very avascular tissue, and it takes quite a while for those little fibroblasts to secrete all of these little fibers. So if you go and mess it up, it's going to take a while for those things to heal. Dense regular connective tissue is going to form things like tendons, most of your ligaments, and then also something called aponeuroses, which is basically just a tendon that's in a really long, thin, flat sheet that's going to cover attached muscles to muscles or muscles to bone. Dense regular connective tissue is also going to provide an excellent attachment point between various structures. All right, so this is going to be tissue structures. It's going to allow tissue structures to withstand a great deal of tension or pulling along the long axis of those fibers. So it's pretty handy stuff. We then have the dense irregular connective tissue. And you can see this is going to look very different than our dense regular. You can see it's much less nicely organized. It's kind of it's irregular, hence the name. So our dense irregular connective tissue is going to be made up of groups again of collagen fibers, but these are typically going to be irregularly arranged around a few fibroblasts. Dense irregular connective tissue is typically going to occur in sheets. This is going to make up things like fascia, as well as the reticular regions of the dermis of the skin. We'll look at that later. It's also going to make up the pericardium of the fibrous pericardium of the heart, periosteum of the bones. There's a lot of different things that are going to, it's going to also form the membrane capsules of various organs, the heart valves. So a lot of dense irregular connective tissue is going to be found throughout the body. Functionally, this stuff is going to provide excellent tensile strength, and it's going to provide it from many directions. Whereas our dense regular connective tissue had excellent tensile strength along the length of those fibers, this is going to have more multi-directional tensile strength. So it is an important difference there. And then last but not least, for our dense connective tissue, we've got our elastic connective tissue. This is going to be tissue that's going to be predominantly made up of elastic fibers, hence the name. This is also going to contain fibroblasts within those tissues, and this, when it is unstained, is going to have sort of a yellowish color to it. This elastic connective tissue is going to be found in the lungs. It's also going to be found in the walls of the elastic arteries that are able to stretch and recoil, as well as several other places. It's the suspensory ligaments of the penis, as well as some of the ligaments between the vertebrae. Functionally, our elastic connective tissue is going to allow for stretching of various organs. This is going to be a very strong kind of connective tissue, and is going to allow for recoil to the original shape after this tissue has been stretched. So elasticity is going to be important to the normal function of lung tissues especially. This is going to allow that tissue to recoil after you exhale. Additionally, elastic arteries are going to be able to recoil and shrink in size between heartbeats in order to help maintain an appropriate flow of blood through the body. So, our next type of supporting connective tissue that we have is cartilage. Cells in mature cartilage are called chondrocytes. These are going to occur either singly or within little groups that are found within these little spaces called lacuna. These are going to be spaces within the extracellular matrix. And lacuna just basically means little lake. So these are just basically little hollow spaces where our little chondrocytes are going to reside. A covering of dense irregular connective tissue is going to be called a perichondrium, and this is going to surround the surface of most cartilage, and it's also going to contain blood vessels as well as nerves, and it's also going to be an excellent source of new cartilage cells. And then last but not least, since our cartilage, like we mentioned, has no blood supply, it is also going to heal very poorly upon any sort of injury, just like what we had with our tendons and ligaments. Poor blood supply, so it's going to have to wait. You're basically just going to have to wait on those cells to secrete those cartilaginous matrix in order for that supporting connective tissue to heal. It's a very slow process. Now, we've got three main types of cartilage. All right, we've got hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. So starting with hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is going to contain a sort of resilient sort of gel as its ground substance. And this is going to look like when it's in the body, sort of like a bluish white shiny substance. This is going to be there are going to be prominent chondrocytes that are going to be found within these little lacuna, which are these little hollow spaces as you can see here. And these are going to be surrounded by perichondrium. So the exceptions to this are articular cartilage within the joints of cartilage and the cartilage of those epiphyseal plates. This is going to be where bones are going to grow in length. Hyaline cartilage is going to be the most abundant type of cartilage that we have in the body, and this is going to be found at the end of long bones, the anterior end of ribs, as well as in your nose, that kind of hard part of your nose, as well as parts of the larynx, the trachea, as well as in the embryonic and fetal skeleton. This is going to provide the framework essentially for the development of bones when you're cooking inside mom still. Functionally, hyaline cartilage is going to provide a smooth surface for movement at the joints. It's also going to provide flexibility and support. This is going to be the weakest type of cartilage that we have of the three, and it can potentially be fractured. So if you've ever eaten like ribs, or like a chicken bone, and like a drumstick, and you've disarticulated that chicken or that rib, you can actually see this hyaline cartilage, this sort of shiny blue-ish, whitish bluish layer essentially at the end of these joints. That's going to be that hyaline cartilage there. So if next time you're going to have barbecue, keep that in mind. It's pretty interesting. Next, we have the fibrocartilage. This is going to have chondrocytes that are going to be surrounded by very thick, visible bundles of collagen fibers that are going to be found within that extracellular matrix. This type of cartilage, this fibrocartilage, is going to lack a perichondrium, that outer layer of cartilage there. Fibrocartilage is found in the pubic symphysis. This is going to be where the hip bones join anteriorly in the front there. This is also going to be found in the intervertebral discs that are going to separate those vertebrae, as well as in the meniscus of the knee, as well as portions of the tendons that are going to insert into the cartilage. Functionally, fibrocartilage is going to be excellent at providing support and joining various structures together. This strength and rigidity that we see in this fibrocartilage is going to make it really strong. Is actually the strongest type of cartilage that we see of the three. And then last but not least, we have our elastic cartilage. This is going to have chondrocytes that are in a sort of a thread-like network that we can see through here, that are interlaced throughout our elastic fibers. These are going to be found within the extracellular matrix, and there is going to be a perichondrium that's present in this elastic cartilage here. Elastic cartilage can be found in the epiglottis as well as the part of the ear, the external part of the ear. It's also found in the auditory or the eustachian tube. This elastic cartilage is going to provide excellent strength and elasticity, and is also going to help to maintain the shape of various structures. So the part of your ear that you can that you see on the side of your head, that's all going to be made up of elastic cartilage. Now, we're just very briefly going to look at the various components of liquid connective tissue. Again, these are both covered in A&P2, so we won't get too in depth here. Our liquid connective tissue, like we mentioned, we've got blood and lymph. We've got a couple of different cells that are going to make up blood. We've got our erythrocytes. These are our red blood cells that are responsible for transporting oxygen to various tissue cells. We've got leukocytes, our white blood cells. These are responsible for any sort of mounting various immune responses and helping protect the body against any sort of invading microorganisms. Platelets are going to be really important in blood clotting, and the matrix that we have for blood is going to be a thick, kind of yellowy liquid that is called plasma. It's going to be made up mostly of water as well as some protein. The second type of liquid connective tissue that we have is it's called lymph. This is going to be extremely similar in composition to the extracellular fluid. The only main difference really is that it's going to flow through lymphatic vessels. This is going to consist of several different types of cells that are going to be within a clear liquid of extracellular matrix. The composition of lymph is going to actually vary depending on from one part of the body to the other. So lymph that's leaving the lymph nodes is going to contain various lymphocytes, whereas lymph that's leaving the small intestines is going to be sort of white in color and is going to contain, this is going to be due to its high dietary lipid content. So this is where we're going to do a lot of absorption of lipids and fats through the intestines. So, moving on now to the various types of membranes. So, membranes are basically, we've mentioned this before, are going to be flat sheets of pliable tissue, and these are going to cover or line various parts of the body. We've got two main types of membranes. So we've got epithelial membranes that we've kind of sort of mentioned before. We've got mucous membranes. These are going to secrete mucus. We've got our serous membranes that we mentioned during our first lecture. And we've got our cutaneous membranes. And then we've got something that doesn't quite fit. We've got these synovial membranes. So we've got essentially four types of membranes here that we're going to discuss. So our first type of epithelial membrane is going to be the mucous membrane. This is going to line body cavities that are going to open directly to the exterior. So this is going to be anything like the digestive tract, respiratory, reproductive tract, etc., urinary tract, all things that are going to be open in some way to the exterior environment. Mucous membranes are going to consist of a lining layer of epithelium as well as an underlying layer of connective tissue. This layer is called the lamina propria. These mucous membrane is going to be really useful because it is going to serve as a barrier that's going to prevent the introduction of various microbes or pathogens, and it's going to produce some difficulty in penetrating for those microbes to penetrate, entering into the internal environment. So it's going to kind of form a safety barrier, essentially, especially in systems that are open to the outside world. Goblet cells, as well as other cells that are found within our epithelial layer, are going to be responsible for secreting mucus, and this is going to help to provide that protective layer, and is also going to help to prevent the cavity from drying out. Useful sort of function there, I suppose, if not a little bit yuck, a little bit gross. But anyhow, so that's our mucous membrane. Now, we've mentioned the lamina propria for our mucous membrane. This is an interesting sort of layer that is going to help to provide support to the epithelium, and it's also going to bind that epithelial layer to the underlying structures. This is going to allow this membrane to have some degree of flexibility, but it's also going to provide an additional level of protection for the underlying structures. The lamina propria is also where we're going to find these various blood vessels residing, and it's also going to help to hold them in place. This is going to help to act as a sort of a vascular source for those overlying epithelium, which, if you will remember, are a very avascular sort of tissue. Now, the lamina propria is also going to be important for the diffusion of oxygen, nutrients, CO2, removal of waste, etc., from that underlying epithelium. Because remember, this is going to be where all of the vasculature is going to reside, and this is going to supply nutrients and waste removal for those cells of the epithelium that are residing above it. So it's pretty handy little layer there, our lamina propria. Our next type of epithelial membrane that we have is the serous membrane. We've mentioned these previously in our first lecture, but bears mentioning again. The serous membrane is going to line body cavities that do not open directly into the exterior, and these are going to also cover organs that are going to be within the body cavities. Serous membranes are going to consist of aerial or connective tissue, as well as are going to be covered by a mesothelium, which is an additional layer there. Serous membranes are going to be composed of two layers. We have our parietal layer and our visceral layer. Remember, the visceral layer of the serous membrane is the layer of membrane that's coming into contact with the viscera or the actual organs, while the parietal layer is the outermost outermost layer there. That mesothelium that we mentioned before is going to be an additional layer of cells, and this is going to be responsible for secreting serous fluid. This is going to be sort of a watery fluid that's going to be responsible for lubricating the various organs, and this is going to allow them to slide nice and easily over each other and over the walls of the various cavities. So this is going to help to reduce friction, so you don't want that kind of like squeaky dry balloons driven together sort of situation. So we have this serous fluid helping to kind of lubricate the whole environment. And then our final type of epithelial membrane that we have is the cutaneous membrane. This is going to cover the entire surface of the body and is going to consist of a superficial portion called the epidermis and a deeper portion called the dermis. We will have an entire lecture on this stuff tomorrow or next time. So we're not going to get too in-depth right now. The epidermis is going to consist of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and this is going to protect an underlying layer of tissue. The dermis is then going to be made up of dense irregular connective tissue as well as some areolar connective tissue. And like I said, we'll have an entire lecture covering this stuff next time, so we're not going to get too in-depth just now. But it's good to know. Our last type of membrane that we have is called a synovial membrane. This is going to be a membrane that's going to line the cavity of freely movable joints, so our synovial joints, or our joint cavities here. All right, so you can see these here. These are going to be things like your knee and your elbow and your hip, etc. These synovial membranes are going to lack an epithelium, and as a result are not going to be technically considered an epithelial membrane, so they are their own thing. These synovial membranes are going to be made up of sort of a discontinuous layer of cells called synoviocytes. And then there's also going to be a layer of connective tissue that's found deep to those synoviocytes. Our synoviocytes are responsible for secreting synovial fluid. And this is going to help to lubricate and provide nourishment for the cartilage. It's going to cover those joints, covering those bones at the movable joints there. Our synovial fluid is also going to contain macrophages. These are going to be cells that are responsible for policing and removing any sort of debris or microbes from the joint cavity. So pretty handy there. Now, that is really that is most of the lecture for today. Like I mentioned, we're not going to discuss bone because that is a type of connective tissue. It is a supporting connective tissue. But there are two types of bone. They've got compact bone and spongy bone, and we'll again talk about that more in chapter 6. So we've got time on that one. Other types of tissue that we have not discussed but are still important. We have our muscle tissues. We've got skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissues. And we've got various types of nervous tissue. We've got neurons and neuroglia. Again, these guys, both of these types of tissue have their entire own chapters dedicated to them, so we're not going to discuss that now. Anyhow, so that is everything that we have for this chapter, for this lecture for today. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please do feel free to contact me. Thank you very much and have a nice day.